Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Sir Bob Geldof, thank you for making time to sit with me here today. It's a pleasure to see you and have your time.
Thank you.
You're currently touring Australia and New Zealand. An evening with Bob Geldof, songs and stories from an extraordinary life. WTF.
No, just life. WTF. The rest you can leave out.
Okay, let's do that.
That's the other guy's bit.
Can I just ask you before we roll in and talk all things Beatles, because there is a fascinating through line of your life with those guys. The WTF piece, was that a thought that came late in the game, and what inspired that?
Because what happened to me is weird. I mean, and if you're asked to do a show just telling the stories people have heard you tell on TV or as a journalist, and I say, why don't you do a show of that? And when you're putting it together, you kind of think that's really weird. That's odd. Why did that happen? Stuff like that. And I mean, it's been exhausting and strange, and I've managed to pack my adult life as much as I can, sort of in panic that I'll return back to the nullity of childhood, So, and weird things have happened to me. Who'd have thought, So who'd have thought is another version of WTF.
There you go. I heard you describe your life once like a sitcom that had these incredible chapters that you couldn't pick where it was going to go next.
Yeah, I mean, it is episodic. I mean, I do a song in the show which when I was doing it, I suddenly realised that extreme events happen to me every decade. In the middle of a decade, I mean, something seriously fundamental to my life happens. And I thought that's really weird, because I've been saying for years, just as you said, that my life is episodic. I'll be going along in the middle of doing something, and it's pretty weird, and suddenly you realise you are in the middle of a scene, and you haven't written the scene, and there's no way you can exit the scene until it comes to an end. And it leads inevitably to some other scene which is unpredictable, like the road less travelled sort of thing. So when I did this song called Young and Sober, which I did in a corny sort of old Irish style, just on piano, I just put it on as the secret track on an album, which turned out to be a secret album because nobody bought the fucking thing. But so don't go looking for it. It starts in 1955 when something significant happens when I'm a child, 65, 75, 85, 95, 05. And I guess if I updated it and if I thought about 2015 and 2025 now, I mean, it continues. It's been really strange. I mean, look, it's just... but tiring and not necessarily exhilarating. And I'm never aware that it's weird until it's happened,
Yeah.
So.
I remember reading in your autobiography this lovely, succinct line that my childhood was all books and rock and roll.
Yeah.
That might sound more romantic than it might have actually been, but could you unpack that a little bit and I guess what literature did for you, and then what rock and roll or music of any kind did for you in those years?
The two were of a piece. I can't separate them. Because I was reading books, now retrospectively I can see, I was reading books that mirrored what was happening to me as a boy. So largely in our house, my mother was dead, my father was away 5 days of the week. So it was myself and my sisters. One just stayed in school till late, the other got out and got married. So I was essentially by myself. So it was... it's Ireland, it's cold, there was no money, so it was crap. And so I was reading books, I guess, that somehow mirrored that, but in an odd way, like John Steinbeck and those sort of people, Dickens, Studs Terkel. But when the rock and roll happened in 63, say, to me, I was the perfect age. I was 12. And I just, as I say, I hit the 60s running. And those guys, all those bands, I don't think they thought were hanging around for long. So Mick and Keith would always say, "Don't listen to us, listen to Howlin' Wolf, listen to Muddy Waters."
Lead Belly.
Yeah, and so I did, and it turned out that Mick and Keith were right. These were, this purity of this seemingly naive but deeply sophisticated music at 12, like it riveted me. But so did they, because they gave it they invested the blues essentially a music of fatalism. Woke up this morning, it's shit. And they invested that with youth and vigor and sexuality and made it modern. And so the Beatles come along, and they, it's the end of deference. That's it. They were funny and optimistic and joyful, but they just didn't understand what this authority thing was. And they were so funny with it. It seemed absolutely natural. Yeah, what the hell? Who are you?
Yeah.
Sir somebody, this, that, the other. So what? So all these lessons were imbibed, and then Dylan comes along and specifically articulates change. The others suggested it, but he was specific. And so what happened at that period was the post-war boom, the baby boomers as they're called now, but that post-war cohort of massive shift in population came of an age where they wanted to make the world for themselves. They didn't want to inherit the world of their parents. And so, the old reaction set in and they came out against it. So, as I say, I was exactly the right age to listen to that. I was in the exact right circumstances. And those guys were, talking about the books they were reading. Lennon was always talking about it, Dylan specifically. And so I started reading James Baldwin, and Baldwin led me to other people. But I always read anyway, because there was no telly in the house, there was no money. So it was radio and books from the library, school library. No one to make me do homework. So what do you entertain yourself with? Books that somehow reflect, albeit bizarrely, your circumstances, and music that articulated for you the otherwise inexpressible. I didn't know what was going on in my head, but they did, and they could say it. And then the blues guys expressed my soul, if you like. So it's all a mix, and what they were talking about was deeply political. They were talking about the inevitability of change, the desirability of change, and you want it now. And if you're in the way, get the fuck out.
Yeah.
And so that's literally everything that's happened to me up to this point. And all I understood from them was that rock and roll was the language of change, because that's what I was picking up. And if that's true, then rock and roll, by definition, becomes the platform for change. And so that's Live Aid. And that's really everything from them. And if I hadn't have had rock and roll, I'd have had the books, but I wouldn't have known how to put what I was reading in the books into practice, whether in my life or outside of that. So, We Shall Overcome, wandering around Trafalgar Square or something, singing We Shall Overcome, you won't. If all you're doing is singing a song, you need to step outside of that and put what you are singing into action. Now, most people aren't interested in that, but what I learned from those guys was that's the only way to do things. Mick Jagger was, protesting, walking in Grosvenor Square. John Lennon marched up and down, singing Power to the People. Bob Dylan was down there with, the NACCP rallies. These guys stepped out of being the rock star and engaged. And they engaged in the only way they knew how, by, singing about it or utilising their celebrity, their fame as a currency. Celebrity is simply a currency. How do you want to spend it? A plumber can't do it because he ain't going to be a celebrity. But nor is it the job of an artist to do it. The job of an artist, the only job, is to make good art. And they only fail when they make bad art. But if you are interested in other stuff, fine. A plumber can bore the arse off you with his political opinions, but dude, fix the fucking toilet. And if you don't fix it, then, I'm not interested in your opinions. So it's the same sort of thing.
Yeah. If we could go back in time, that there was a night at the Adelphi Cinema in Dublin in 1963. And you're eloquently describing what I've always thought about those four guys. I've always seen them as the original punks. that there was this kind of pushing against.
Well, the punk thing which we joined up on was exactly the same deal 10 years later for the same reason. You know, the economies of Britain was 27% inflation in 1976. That means there is no future in the economy. There's no point in getting wages, you know, because you can't buy anything. Food prices so it's the end. You get the Ramones and Blondie and the New York Dolls because you get the richest city in the world, in the richest country in the world, bankrupt in 1976. How ironic. So you get ironic rock. Huh. You get the Ramones, you get your Blondie, you get New York Dolls. Ireland has a zero economy. You get the Boomtown Rats. Of course you get Johnny Rotten brilliantly singing "There is no future in England's dreaming," you know, with the noise from God, you know, thundering out. This is real anger. And, you know, there's a reason these things happened in the rock and roll period, which is now over. So what I learned from those guys in the boys and girls with guitars at 19 and 20 years old when I was 12, I simply repeated. You know, it was the only vernacular I understood. It was the only language to hand. And I describe it as, in those bleak days of being a child, what's it, a golden thread descending from the purple rock and roll ether, offering me whole other universes of thought and possibility. And I clung on to that thing, that golden thread, and still do to this, sitting here with you this morning.
Yeah, I almost don't want to go back in time and not continue on that thread, but if I could go back, I'm just curious what that night was like for you, because it had great meaning to you, as I understand it, and it wasn't just about that performance. It's about what happened with a meeting with...
Yeah, with the guys.
Yeah, could you take us through that night? Am I right, you were with your sister that night, yeah?
Yeah, my sister had to take me. I mean, the Beatles were the go-to thing. My sister resented them because she was a big Cliff fan. My two sisters shared a bedroom, and wall to ceiling was Cliff posters, the Shadows, like literally all of them. So the Beatles come along, she's about 14. All her mates are into these cute boys from, you know, Liverpool. And the Love Me Do was released on the same day as my birthday, on my 11th birthday. So, you know, I get to be 12, and my sister had better get along with the program with her mates. You know, it's like right now my daughters are sort of went to see Taylor Swift because they had to get in with the vibe. She didn't quite get it, but forced herself to get it, you know, to go along to see Taylor. So it was the same deal with my sister and her mate Michelle. But my dad made them take me. And they were really fed up with this. You know, I was the sort of annoying younger brother. So we were in the Adelphi cinema, you know, the ground floor stalls, balcony, slanted towards the stage. Green lino, you know, down either side, left and right of the main block of seats. We were on the left-hand block, about halfway up, good seats. My sister was on the edge of the line, of the row of seats, me next, and then Michelle, because, you know, they didn't want me wandering around and stuff. And in truth, I wanted to go to the show because Helen Shapiro had been on the bill. And Helen Shapiro was this 11-year-old North London Jewish girl who looked like Amy Winehouse, even though she was 11. So I think Amy picked up a lot of her shtick from Helen.
I can see it now that you say it.
And Helen had a song called Walking Back to Happiness, whoop-ah, oh yeah. And, you know, I thought she was cute and my age. So, you know, I was going for it. And I wanted to see her. And I actually subsequently later did a song called Walking Back to Happiness, which is not a homage to my heroine of 11 years old, but it was just it just popped into my head. And but by the time the Beatles rolled up in Ireland, Helen was like, you know, somewhere down at the bottom of this long bill. We were all sort of fairly pretty alert to the Beatles because Liverpool is just, you know, Dublin too. It's just the next city along, and it's Irish. And the Beatles, I think all three of them had immediate relations who were Irish, especially George, his immediate uncle and aunt were Paddies, you know. So this was all, the lads were coming home. There was an element of that in it. And what I remember is, I don't remember the other acts. So heavy draped curtains, red, lights go down. I heard Ringo, I now know Ringo just tapping the, just tuning the snare. I heard that going on behind the thing, but I didn't know what that was. Now I know I could hear it go, seeing, you know, just tuning up a bit. And then, curtain opens, oh yeah, fucking hell. So
incredible.
Yeah, it was incredible. But what was incredible was, oh my God, they're real. They're real people, you know. They were so ubiquitous. They were everywhere, dolls and this and there they actually are real. Now I know that because I brought my little grandson to see his first football match. He's a Spurs fan, and we stood above the terrace where the teams were lining up in you know, Stars, the Spurs home stadium. Can't remember the name. And Harry Kane, who was captain of England, captain of Spurs, he was there, you know, in the front of the squad, lining up. And I just heard Stella just looking down, just saying, "Harry Kane is real." He just said it to himself, you know, like, that's mad. This person is on my wall and I follow and all that. That was the sense I got. And then the noise, I guess, was crap, because then you just used the house tannoy. And I'd never heard a noise like it, because I'd never been to a live rock and roll show. But it wouldn't be anything like now. I think they still were using AC30s. They hadn't gone, the Vox hadn't made hundreds for them, because, you know, how do you overwhelm the sound? They were exactly like you've seen film of that time, Suits, etc. But really, my memory is the noise that erupted. And I mean, it was scary as anything. I'm a boy, sex is kind of beginning to happen in me, you know, that confusion and stuff. But I have never, ever, ever heard this wailing, this wailing, like, you know. Now, I've been to Duran Duran and Take That and Boyzone and all the boy bands. They were the original boy band. I've been to all them, and I've heard the scream. And there was a period when, in fact, the Rats, I remember walking on stage at the Liverpool Empire. You know, this is hallowed ground. This is where they played. You know, this is Liverpool, and people screaming at us. And it really fucking annoyed me. And I just stop. And I stopped the band. I said, you know, what? And I sort of did, you know, drew a circle around my face. This? Seriously? Him? Really? I said, just stop that nonsense. You know, I couldn't stand it, you know. So what's it? Okay, play on. You know, they were, oh, that's crap. He's useless. He's not fun. So, but with the Beatles, it was just, well, the word is manic, because that is the word they use, but it was abandoned femininity, just lost in this howl of girlhood. And I was frightened because my sister suddenly was taken up with this hysteria, you know, and it's like, even if you were indifferent, once the mob starts, something triggers, like, you know, when riots happen. And she was achingly leaning forward, stretching towards the stage, her body shaking, and Michelle beside me, her mate, was doing the same. They were crying. I was going, fucking hell, get a grip, you know, but also frightened because I was surrounded by girls, you know, millions of them, all just howling. And I looked behind my sister as she arched forward, and I looked at the green lino, and streams of piss were pouring down this thing. And what I remember is little rivulets of scuff from the soles of your shoes. Little dirt banks were forming as this piss tried to make its way, you know, inevitably towards Paul or George or John. And I thought, fucking, this is like, so for me, forever, the Beatles are the smell of girls pissing, you know?
Wow. Now, somehow, some way, there's a meeting.
Yeah, so it was, we had to get to the matinee because my dad insisted we come back. And they were doing 2 shows. The show was only 20 minutes or something. And across the road literally across the road, directly across the road from the Adelphi is the Gresham Hotel, which was posh. Not as posh as the Shelburne, but almost. And clearly the Beatles were staying there. How do we know? One, because there were 2,000 people out there day and night, all shouting for them. John, Paul, George, and Ringo. So my sister, now bitten with the bug, was not going to get the bus home. So we had their first album, and pretty smartly, my sister and Michelle worked out that there must be a service centre. We now call it service centres. We just thought back door. So we went around behind the punters, and there must have been some security. Anyway, I don't know. But we got to the back door, and it was the service entrance. We went in, and I don't remember a lift, but clearly it's the Beatles. So they're going to be on the top floor. Where else would they possibly stay? The Beatles would be on the very top floor. So we just walked up the concrete stairs at the very back until it stopped. And there was a metal door, and now I'd know that largely they'd be shut, but back then we just assumed it would be open, and it was. And we were in a corridor, and I know this to be a true image because I've stayed in the Beatles suite subsequently. There's the Elizabeth Taylor suite on the right hand at the end of the corridor. There's the Beatles suite on the left. And we thought it was the Beatles, okay, it's left or right, 2 big doors. So we turned left and knocked on the door. And fuck me, there's 19-year-old Paul McCartney. He had his tie undone and his top collar undone. He still had the waistcoat on, that was undone, and the peg trousers and boots. I took it all in. And he goes, all right, kids, yeah, what can we do? Great. And we just stared and held out the album. And he said, do you want the other fellas? And we said, yes, please, Your Majesty, or whatever, So we went in, and there was Ringo and George sitting there, same, relaxing, having a fag. But what were the Beatles doing? This is the question I ask everyone. In their downtime, between shows, couldn't leave the hotel, couldn't go downstairs. What were the Beatles doing in their downtime?
What were they doing in their downtime?
Personally answering stacks of fan mail.
Wow.
Obviously Brian Epstein said, this is, you've got to do it. This is part of the job. Yeah. So it will be social media. It's like answering you're being involved in that. And they had to. I mean, we now know that these are quite long letters. They come up in auctions all the time.
This sounds like a scene out of A Hard Day's Night.
Well, I can't really remember Hard Days. I remember I thought it was a great film, but John wasn't there. He was probably off doing some interviews or something. So it was just the 3 of them. So we only got the 3 of them. But I remember Paul just saying, okay, come in. And George being really annoyed. And he went, literally, this is radio, so he went sort of annoyed with his hands, like, what the fuck, can we not get 5 minutes, He was always grumpy. I mean, I got to know George pretty well, but he was always talking about money, always grumpy. And but subsequently, George came to see the Rats in Oxford, and we were all freaked out because we knew a Beatle was there. And afterwards, he came back, and he was so skinny and small, we couldn't believe it. But our sound guy, I was cool. I said, hi, George, how are you? Did you enjoy the show? Shitting myself, a Beatle. And Robbie, the sound guy, who subsequently did AC/DC and the Stones and that, he had his American girlfriend with him. And I said, George, this is Robbie. And he said, yeah, great sound, Robbie. And the girlfriend, and she just literally just stood and stared, couldn't move and just stared. And I just thought, it must be horrible. And George just said hello and walked past her. And she was literally still staring at a blank space, long after he passed by. I mean, it was absolutely phenomenal. Anyway, the lads signed the thing. I don't know what happened to the album over the years. It got lost or something. I don't think Lynn still has it, but it was only the 3 signatures. So, yeah. That was it. But having said all that, it was the Rolling Stones did it for me.
Yeah.
I saw them the same year, and I saw Dylan the same year at the same gig.
That's incredible. What a year.
The Stones were a boys band. Yeah, I don't mean a boys band like girls get. I mean they were a gang. And unlike the Beatles, there was literally no professionalism. They wandered on sort of picking their noses almost. And Mick just stayed at the mic. He didn't dance around them. And he just stared loose-lipped with this sort of contemptuous insolence at the crowd, just moving just slowly his head. Brian just looked around the theatre, just closed his eyes. Keith was the impish one. He was skipping and smiling at the audience. Bill just stood there stock still, and Charlie just kept the groove. And the noise those guys made, wow, that music just, wow. And I didn't understand it. I was the same age. I was riveted by Mick. I didn't understand that he was sexy. Yeah, he was. I now know that. But then I just thought, just this figure that you must watch. And, the place went nuts as well. Mick would just point at a girl and she'd go out and stuff like that. And it began to kick off because that music was somehow different and rebellious, and their attitude was something. Dylan was a student outfit. A lot of students went black polo necks. The sound was dreadful because, his harmonica and the tannoys. I was in the balcony for that.
Yeah.
And we had gougers, we called them, corner boys, hooligans, working class kids. They were in the front, and Dylan was wee, 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 and then he was bored doing his folk stuff, And they said, "Turn the bleeding noise down, Bob, will you?" They were shouting at the stage. Like, I was silent, shitting myself, because these are rough kids. And then Dylan was doing his thing. And they said, "Do tambourine, man, Bob." Dylan didn't do anything, couldn't hear it. I was, Jesus, Bob, will you fucking do tambourine, man? Eventually Dylan hears him, and he goes, and he says, "The next song's called Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man." "Good man, Bob." And of course he does a completely different song. Jesus, Bob, will you fucking do the song? And like the next song's called Hey, Mr. And he never played it. He just announced each one. So, deeply formative year.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
That's pre-electric Dylan too.
It was, but I never gave a crap about that. This is nonsense about Electric Dylan.
Yeah.
It was a hyped up thing. He was playing electric. If you listen to the early albums, he's noodling. You forget he played with Little Richard. He played it. He played in Duluth, Minnesota. He played piano with rock bands. Dylan was always electric. He just latched onto this new thing that's cool, and he loved Woody Guthrie. So he found his soul with Woody, and he put his rock and roll into that. And he arrives in New York, and he goes to see Woody, and the hip thing is folk. So he goes along. Genius. He reinterprets, he reimagines, he reinvents folk, but with the language of the King James Bible and rock and roll. Of course. So I grew up with that, and it informed everything I knew.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I can hear that through the music, and was only recently going through the book of lyrics and really appreciating how much of those echoes of style I can see through that. I know we're tight on time, and there's so much to unpack, so I appreciate the time you've given me. I'd like to jump into a couple of things really quickly. With that relationship with George and that connection, was there a connection with him, a conversation on the back of what he had done with Bangladesh at the time of Live Aid? Was there ever any conversations? Was there any kind of applause or recognition to you from him?
Yes, there was, I was working on an underground newspaper in Canada, and I was the music editor, so I reviewed his solo stuff, which was absolutely terrible. He was wired out of his face on coke, I guess. He dressed like ridiculously, some bloody...
The overalls?
And the overalls.
74, I think that is. Yeah.
Absolutely crap. And, all this Mystic 3 bollocks. I wrote a really bad, terrible review, and it was picked up on the Melody Maker in Britain, and it was picked up in Rolling Stone, and they did it and everything. But he was terrible. If he was great, I said great. If it was mediocre, terrible.
Yeah.
And I just said, stop, But I had this thing, like both Paul's albums were terrible. John did 2 good solo albums. But none of them ever achieved the peaks of art that are the Beatles. So, and how could you expect them to? But this was really bad. So then we start our band, and then he comes to see us in Oxford. And subsequently then, I think the next time we met, I was in Dave Stewart's house in London of the Eurythmics, and he's a mate, and we were playing guitar. And 2 things happened. The fax machine started clattering, and Dave went over, and Leonard Cohen was faxing him some lyrics and asking could he put some melodies to it. And then the video phone rings, and George is there at the bottom of the stairs saying, and I think he said, "Do you want to play?" He said, like a kid coming to his May. So he came upstairs, and of course Dave is freaked out, like he knows him and the Beatles, but you're still freaked out. It's a Beatle. And so we're playing. Dave starts doing Here Comes the Sun. And George says, he goes, "What's the next chord?" And like Dave says, "Come on." And he goes, "I only played the fucking thing once," and which is probably true.
Yeah.
And so that was that. But come Live Aid, I saw him once, and we were sitting down. He was completely pissed, and he was saying, "Don't make the mistake I made." And he said, "Stay away from lawyers." I said, "I'm not talking to lawyers. I'm not talking to managers. I'll talk to the guys. That's it. There's no money. There's no sound check. You come and you do it, or you don't. That's up to you. But I'm talking to the guys and speak to the manager. I'm not speaking to the manager. See you later." Having said that, a bunch of the managers were bringing Elliot Roberts, Dylan's guy. He said, "Do you want Tom Petty to come?" What? Yeah, of course, So a lot of them actually, Roger, who did Tina, Roger said, "Do you want Eric to come? Do you want this?" And I was, dude, So they called me. And George was really worried that I would repeat what happened with Bangladesh, a total disaster as far as he was concerned. All the money went to the lawyers, all of this. But George, was, for such a clever man, for such a musical man, you'll see him in Jackson's Let It Be, where he's going through the accounts. And he says to Ringo, "Do you want to come and see where your last farthing went?" For all the niggledy stuff about money. He tried to sell me Handmade Films.
Wow.
Handmade Films is the greatest British film ever made. It's The Life of Brian. Yeah. There's no question about that. It constantly wins it. And great other things. And I had a production company, TV, and he said, "Do you want to buy Handmade Films?" I said, "Of course I don't want to buy Handmade Films." He goes, "Why not?" And I said, "Because no one knows who ultimately owns it, George. You sold this bit to that guy, that bit to that guy to get movies." He said, "Dennis fucked me, his partner." And I said, "Well, yeah, but nobody's going to buy this from you." And so he kept on at me to buy this. He'd call me and that. So he wasn't good at business. So it very like guys in bands, they always blame the other one. Like, John was hopeless at business. Paul was on it. He was right about Klein.
Yeah.
Klein was going to rape them, and he did, and Paul knew it, but Paul is the sober one trying to win favour with everyone all the time, but John was a leader, and Paul would not go up against that because he'd be slapped down, You could hear him in that secret mic in the
vase,
Yeah, and he's saying to, the passive-aggressive Paul, he's saying, "You're the boss, I'm not trying to take over from you, but, you'll always be the boss, but, I just think we should maybe, and he's trying to get them to do something by Friday. Just, guys, can we just get some? So he really was the manager. He came up with the Sgt. Pepper's. Okay, I agree, we can't tour. Why don't we do this? A brilliant concept. Let's move outside of us. He came up with Magical Mystery Tour, flawed deeply, based on all the stuff he was looking at, but, a couple of great tunes that will stand the test of time. So it's worth it for that. So Paul gets a bad rap, I think, and he was trying to work the politics. So George really, even though he thought he knew about business, he knew about money, where it went, but never sure why it went.
Yeah.
And so with Bangladesh, he got the guys together. He wanted to do a good thing. All he knew was lawyers and man. That's all he knew.
Yeah.
The Beats were surrounded by endless interests. Brian kept a hold of things. Without Brian Epstein, it does not happen.
Yes.
It doesn't happen.
That's the truth.
They'd still be out doing a great rock and roll band, but they'd still be out scuzzing around doing the nostalgia circuit.
They might have been the Searchers.
Yeah, exactly.
You know.
So that's what he was like. I liked him very much. When he died, we were in Italy, and we were doing a TV show, and I just binned the 2 songs we were doing, and I just did 2 George songs. That's all we could do.
Yeah. I know we've only got a little bit of time left. Some of my favourite moments in Live Aid are obviously Macca-centric. There's a beautiful clip I was only watching the other day. It's maybe 30 seconds where the camera sits on Bono, McCartney and Freddie sharing the one mic.
Yeah.
And you can see Bono's face with this adoration in his eyes and Freddie's joy. And I know Freddie loved Lennon and was a Beatles fan himself, obviously. But you can see Paul is alive.
Yeah, I mean, nobody will go... there is hierarchy in rock and roll. And at the very, very, very top, unassailed, is the Beatles. And I mean every single band you can name. And there's still an intense rivalry between the remaining Rolling Stones and the remaining Beatles. They will not put it to bed. I can tell you stories about Mick, and Paul. And when we were doing Live 8, where Paul opened and closed with U2 doing, it was 20 years ago today, because it was 20 years ago since Live 8. Pete Townsend called me about 1:30 in the morning when I'm just desperate to go to bed. Yeah. And Mick has called him and said, Mick, typical, wait till the last minute, see if it's going, I want in. Let's put a band together, Pete, even though the Who were doing it. So Pete calls this, Mick's called, he wants to put a band. Remember, this is Bob Geldof speaking. Yeah. I'm getting calls on my phone from Pete, fuck off Townsend, and Mick, fuck off Jagger. Yeah. This is my... Quite literally my bread and butter. This was the thing that, filled me.
Yeah.
And so they say, Bob, what's it? Now I know them. Life, what the fuck, And Mick wants to come over and do. I said, fantastic. And he says, I'm going to get a rehearsal room. What should we do? I said, up to you, mate. It's going to be amazing. I said, who else in the band? He said, I don't know. I'll put something together. Next minute, the phone calls. All right, Mac, it's Macca, how's it going, Paul? I say, hi, Paul. I'm on last, aren't I? And I say, yeah, just checking, because I've worked out this end thing, because I hear Mick and Peter doing something. So this goes on for half an hour,
Wow.
Like, I'm on last, right? Let's be sure. Pete finally calls me and says, Bob, you can't fuck a Beatle. And I said, I'm not fucking a Beatle. And he said, you want to put us on after? I said, I never said anything about putting you on afterwards. Paul's opening and closing, that's the deal. And he goes, I'm not going to fuck with the Beatle. I said, well, no one is. And he goes, okay. So it never happened. Right. But, because they would not fuck with the Beatles.
Yeah.
The Beatles said, I'm on last. Okay.
That's great stuff. Yeah. There's so much about Live Aid, and obviously we don't have time, but...
Well, I remember that I had to write to him to ask him to play.
Yeah.
Macca. Remember, it's 6 years since John died and he hadn't played. Yeah. And I think it was Linda, who I really loved. I got Paul to come on the show. I did a DJ slot in 96 FM in Perth one winter for a week. And Paul was there. I got him to come on, and we played with maybe champion Jack Dupree. No, blues.
I don't want to cut your flow, but I've seen footage of that, and it's beautiful footage. It's a little shaky in the quality. You're sitting next to Paul, and they ask him, "What do you want to play next?" And he asks for Lithium from Nevermind.
Yeah.
And then you both have an exchange about the importance of what Nirvana's doing.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there watching, and I'd read your autobiography not long before, and I'm thinking, with everything that you've done in your life, I'm thinking, here's this man sitting next to that guy, and this guy that you're sitting next to has echoed in a change in your life and opened up the world. And there you are sitting with him while he's talking about this other band that's come along that's opening up another channel.
Completely.
I mean, it's incredible.
He was always on top. He is always on top of it. I mean, so I think it was Linda, who I loved, really, she was a great woman. And I think Stella just said, you have to do this thing. So he agrees to do it, which blew us away. I just said, one song, that's all we need. You know, that's it. Just let it be. Give us the benediction. You know, in the letter I said, your achievement is to give joy and optimism to a generation that really didn't have it, and continue. And I said, so that's what we need on this. And he was driving up to Wembley from Sussex, and he was listening to the show, and he was freaking out. He was getting more and more nervous as big band after big band nailed it. Just nailed it, way above their normal performances. And he was freaking out because he was just going to be there with the piano, and he thought he should have a band. And, the professional, the kid who left Liverpool to go to Hamburg, the same guy. And now he's going up to this gig, and he's going, geez, forgetting that he is one of the greatest songwriters of all time. Yeah. And they said, he wants to turn back. And Linda said, you are not turning back, you're going. And so he gets there, and again, don't fuck with the Beatles, everyone is, not blown away, but hey, Paul, great man, glad you could join it, And he gets on stage, and then his mic goes down. And we're going, oh, bloody hell. So the crowd, listen closely to this. Paul's mic goes down and let it be, and he's going, and he's relaxed once he's on stage, but suddenly the whole 80,000 people start singing the song for him. And he just turns around and just grins, And meanwhile, I'm backstage. Pete Townsend says, we got to help Paul. And Bowie and Pete grab my arms and push me out on stage. David Bowie, Paul McCartney, Pete Townsend, and Bob Geldof. Life. What the fuck?
That's a perfect place to come to a stop. I listen to you speak, and that boy seems to still be in there with that awe and wonder for all you've done and lent into with the band, the success of the band and the solo career and everything that's being done with Live Aid. And there's obviously a fire in you, but I still hear the boy in there. Is this tour for you a part of recognising that boy is still there, that it has been a hell of a life, and that?
Well, it's the improbability of that child and the circumstances, and you can't plan it, and just the various twists and turns that it took. So there's absolutely no plan you could ever make for it. And so it's highly improbable what happened. And, you make sense of it by something like this. It sounds pretty inevitable when I talk through it, but absolutely not a single bit of it is, all chance. Yeah. And as regards to the actual person, did that person grow up? Did they mature? Did they become more expansive? Not at all. Because of the circumstances very early on in the boy's life, it engendered a rage and an anger. Yeah. And I didn't know that then. The child just did whatever he had to survive. And it sounds like you're playing the fiddle here, that Irish expression. But no, it's not. There wasn't any self-pity. It just, you're a kid. It just is. That's it. That's life. But you understood it was shit because your mates were going home to, dinner and a family and maybe telly, if they had one then. And there is no possibility of that for you. So I guess there's a rage and an anger. The other thing is that because you don't have parents, you don't understand authorities. Parents are the ones who tell you where the parameters of existence are, where the boundaries of what is permissible in a group is. That was never there for me. A family teaches you structure, teaches you, politics, how to negotiate with siblings, how to get what you want, how to argue, how to whinge, all of that. That just wasn't there. So when you leave school's the only structure which you detest. The only authority you meet, which you don't understand, are priests in my case, and the police subsequently. I didn't understand that. I didn't understand. Of course I understand that they are the law, if you like, but I didn't understand how they could ever have any say over what I did. So all that is very juvenile. But that is what you see in the man. You know, I'll meet heads of states, I'll do all that, but any fear of meeting authority, fear of making a fool of myself is present always, but fear of authority or stuff like that just doesn't happen. And so we go back to the Beatles and the lack of deference. It's the same thing. I can't defer to it. It is in some cases very immature, and it is a weakness in a lot of cases, because many people are owed respect because of what they've achieved or what their country has asked them, elected them to do, and therefore, because the people have told them, they are deserving of respect because they are doing that because people have elected them to. And I get that, and I make sure that I articulate that. But the rest of it does start with, of course, you know, as there's a great line from W.B. Yeats which slips me now. At the bottom of the ladder, what's he say? The foul rag and bone shop of the heart.
Wow.
Is at the end of the ladder, and it's also the beginning of the ladder. And the foul rag and bone shop of the heart is where it began, but it scrambled its way out of that.
There's a line I heard Michael Parkinson say once, that you were one of the greatest conversations he'd ever had, and one of the most fascinating conversations he'd ever had. I get a little bit of a sense of what he meant. Sir Bob Geldof, thank you for sitting down with me here today. It's been a great honour.
Thanks, man.
We hope you enjoyed the show. You know the name, look up the socials. You'll find us on Facebook and Instagram, where we can all come together. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe and spread the word. It all helps raise the profile of the You Can Talk to Me podcast. Thanks for listening.